Hello, and welcome to my presentation on the Japanese language and its contrast to English. Let's get started, shall we? So, Japanese, or Nihongo, is spoken by approximately 125 million native speakers. It is spoken primarily in Japan, but also in Korea and on Hawaii. The language itself is probably related to Korean, possibly to Manchurian, Mongolian, and most surprisingly, to Turkish. It is not, however, related to Chinese. In modern Japan, everybody understands and can speak an approximation of the standard language, though wide dialectal variety exists. A small disclaimer right here. Eric Wikström has done a presentation before me. This is his second one on the Japanese language. And since he has the good fortune of actually speaking the language, his presentation should be a little bit more in-depth. But, well, so check that one out as well if you want to. Let's go into the grammatical differences right away. So let's start with word order. English, as we all know, is an SVO language. Japanese, on the other hand, is an SOV language. This means that broad constituents of sentence structure are ordered very differently in the two languages. What does this mean? Well, let's illustrate this fact with a few samples. So the first one is これは何ですか? Which means this, what is, which should be what's this in English. You know, the reversed order between the verb and the object. There are also a few particles to consider. これは. The va is a topic particle. Denotes that this is what I'm speaking about. なんです, what is, and then ka at the end, which denotes that it's a question. It's a question particle. Let's take the second example. 私はこれを書きました. So this basically means this wrote. Note the reversed order again, which should be I wrote this in English. So 私, I, and then wa is another particle, which denotes what I'm speaking about. これを, which is the object particle. Then 書きました is a verb. So let's take a look at the third one, which is 東京は日本の首都です. So this basically means Tokyo, Japan, capital is, with the verb at the end. And particles, as usual, the wa denotes what I'm speaking about. Nippon no is genitive particle, and then capital, and then the verb at the end. This should be Tokyo is the capital of Japan. Let's move on. Let's take a look at the verbs, for instance, which is a pretty interesting point when it comes to Japanese. So in Japanese, the verb is a self-contained entity or unit, meaning that every verb can stand as a whole sentence on its own, wherein no subjects or objects are required to be expressed. What does this mean? Well, let's take one. Let's take an example. 忘れた. I've forgotten it. You see that it's simply one verb, which is treated as a whole unit. It's one verb in Japanese, but it's several words in English, right? It's treated as a whole unit. This might denote some problems. An extension like this: did you get the bread? Yes. Went to supermarket and bought. It might denote that the subject and object are omitted. So the correct version should be, yes, I went to the supermarket and bought it, right? Sometimes the copula be might be excluded. I terribly bad at English instead of I am terribly bad at English, right? Japanese expresses tense, voice, and other meanings through changes in the form of the verbs, but it has no auxiliary verbs at all. As in the reverse situation from the one above might thus appear because of the confusion. The copula be may be inserted inappropriately instead of excluded. So this might happen. I was open the door. We are write to each other in English instead of I open the door or we write to each other in English. Let's move on. Verb does not change for person or number, so students easily forget the English third singular S. This is a common problem with many other students as well, but this might appear as well. She usually go to country at weekend instead of she usually goes to the country at the weekend. Let's move on. Number and the use of articles. So many nouns referring to people may take a number of plural suffixes, but if the context makes plurality clear, the noun goes unmarked, as does all other nouns not referring to people. Japanese, therefore, does not note plurality in their sentences on a regular basis, nor does Japanese have a distinction between countable and uncountable nouns. With this in mind, Swan and Smith notes that this might prove a major obstacle for Japanese learners. That is, the usage of articles in denoting numbers. Let's take an example. In Japan, industrial product is cheap because we have an economic growth, but vegetable is expensive because we Japanese have few lands. Well, this should be probably. In Japan, industrial products are cheap because we have economic growth, but vegetables are expensive because we have very little farmable land. Let's move on to adjectives and adverbs. Adjectives in Japanese work similar to Japanese verbs, as in they can be inflected and work as a contained entity or unit. Yokatta means was good. Yokattara, if it's good, or you like. This might lead to Japanese students to treat English adjectives like verbs, for instance by, once again, omitting the copula be. That film good, instead of that film was good. We should not afraid the failure, instead of we should not be afraid of the failure. Since a number of English verbs can be followed by adjectival complements, for instance, look, sound, and turn, this might produce mistakes for Japanese students because their equivalent are adverbial in nature, resulting in a sort of, well, this is my description, but a false friend situation. So it looks tastily, it sounds strangely, it turned bluely. Note that there are adverbial at the end. Concluding remarks. This denotes a little bit about the culture and things that might be interesting for, in case you ever encounter a Japanese-speaking student that wants to learn English, that is. I'll quote from Swan and Smith. The traditional Japanese regard for authority and formality is in tune with teacher-dominated lessons, where much heed is paid to the correct answer, learning of grammar rules and item by item, rather than contextualized vocabulary. As such, writing and reading performance are ranked higher than speaking or listening. Further, and this is good to remember, the Japanese, as a culture, do not care to be put on the spot in public. Getting it wrong can be a cause of real shame, especially in front of classmates who are younger or socially inferior, as in the Japanese sense. A spontaneous answer is rare. I would suggest that you, as a teacher, avoid the what do you think of so and so topics whenever you do, avoid them at all costs, I would say. Or at least make some introduction to them, or I don't know, don't just start with what do you think of this, since it's rare to get a spontaneous answer, and it might just be followed by a long silence. And if you're teaching Japanese students, for instance, they might turn to their classmate and discuss the whole sort of the answer before they're giving it to you. Spontaneous answer is, as I said, rare. That is all I wanted to talk about when it comes to the Japanese language. I hope that this presentation has been informative, and I thank you all for listening. See you around.